I'm the MP for St. John's South Mount Pearl, the most beautiful riding in Newfoundland and Labrador, the most beautiful riding in all of Canada. I'm also the New Democrat critic for post-secondary education. Welcome to the round table on post-secondary. When my leader, Thomas Mulcair, telephoned me after he won the NDP leadership last spring and offered me the position, thank you, ma'am, of post-secondary education critic, it was the last critic area I expected. And I mean the last. I'm known for my stand, my defense of the East Coast fisheries, and I'm known as a defender of all things Newfoundland and Labrador. On top of that, I never went to university. The longest time I spent in university was when my car broke down in the parking lot of Memorial back in the 1980s. But I'm also a quick learner. I'm a journalist by trade. I covered every major news story to come out of Newfoundland and Labrador over the past 20 years. You name it, and I've researched it, and I've written about it. But post-secondary education, maybe I covered a scandal or two, but that's about it. Then I thought about it. What do I know about post-secondary education? I know that when I graduated high school in 1984 in the small outport community of Harbour Grace, about an hour's drive from St. John's, I knew exactly what I wanted to be. The one-word category beneath my high school yearbook picture, the one-word category was ambition, and I put down journalist. I was lucky, like I say. I knew exactly what I wanted to be. It never occurred to me that I couldn't do exactly what I wanted to do. I'm not that type of person anyway. I took a roundabout route to becoming a journalist. I worked for a couple of years and then enrolled in a 2-year community college program in Newfoundland and Labrador. I graduated in 1989, and I went on to work almost immediately with a daily newspaper, one of the only 2 daily newspapers in Newfoundland and Labrador. My starting salary was $16,500 a year, and I can't tell you how grateful I was for that money, especially in Newfoundland and Labrador. Back then, jobs were few and far between. It's not that way today. Well, not in some areas of Newfoundland and Labrador. So again, what do I know about post-secondary? I know that it's changed. When I graduated high school, post-secondary was accessible. Post-secondary was affordable. When I finished my course of study, I got a job. I was not crippled by student debt. Most of my measly little paycheck went to me, not to pay off debt. All that's different now. One last personal note. I have a 17-year-old son, and he's going to graduate high school in June. I tell him he can be whatever he wants to be. Right now, he wants to be a professional hockey player, and I tell him that's possible. Everything is possible. Everything is impossible. It depends on how you approach it. But my son is lucky. I have the means to help him achieve whatever path he chooses. My son is an exception. When I was appointed post-secondary education critic, it was during the height of the student strikes in Quebec. The Quebec students were outraged at a proposed increase in tuition. They took to the streets by the thousands. We're all familiar with the television images. The situation in Quebec was a provincial issue, but the broader discussion, accessibility and affordability of post-secondary, is a national issue. And that's why we're here today. Accessibility and affordability of post-secondary across Canada, as well as the federal government's role. The way our national Medicare system works is that no matter what province or territory you're in across this country, you can expect to receive a uniform standard of care. You can also expect universal access. The same should hold true with post-secondary education, only it doesn't. When it comes to university tuition, the least expensive across Canada is in my home province of Newfoundland and Labrador, I'm proud to say. The average annual undergrad tuition at Memorial University is $2,649. The highest is in Ontario at $7,180. That's a whopping difference of $4,531. The rest of the provinces fall somewhere in between, with tuition averaging about $5,000 a year across Canada. Keep in mind, that's just tuition. On top of tuition fees, you also have the cost of housing. You have the cost of food. You have the cost of transportation. You have the cost of books. You have the cost of supplies. In terms of housing, too many students can't find decent places to live for affordable prices. in terms of transportation. If you don't live near a university and you don't have access to public transit, which is the case in a lot of places, Newfoundland and Labrador, for example, then many students are forced to buy their own cars. But the price of a vehicle is counted against them in their student loan assessment of borrower assets. As a result, students either get less of a loan or they often buy wrecks, beater cars that aren't fit to be on the road. I heard that story more than once. On top of tuition, on top of the cost of living, of transportation, and of housing, each province also has random fees. For example, I traveled to Alberta recently, Edmonton more specifically, and the University of Alberta, and we were told that students are forced to pay so-called non-institutional fees and market modifiers that are regulated at the university level. Non-instructional fees, for example, could include a gym membership, fees to register for university, or a fee even for a copy of a transcript. As of 2010, non-instructional fees in Alberta averaged $818. And by 2013, they're expected to rise again by another $450. That's over $1,260. The Board of Governors won't allow students to vote on these controversial fees. Market modifiers amount to students paying more for tuition based on what faculty they're enrolled in. For example, if you're in education, if you're in law, medicine, engineering, or business at the University of Calgary, then your tuition went up with market modifiers because it's presumed you'll make more and subsequently have the ability to pay more once you graduate. The tuition rates, assorted fees, added costs, the cost of living, all this adds to student debt, crippling student debt in many cases. How crippling? There are 1.1 million students enrolled in post-secondary education across Canada. The average public debt is $28,000. The total outstanding federal student debt has been estimated at more than $15 billion. In fact, $15 billion was the legislated ceiling, or the lending limit set by the Canada Student Financial Assistance Act. But that ceiling was recently increased by the Conservative government to $19 billion, $4 billion more. This year alone, almost 425,000 students across Canada were forced to borrow in order to finance their education. On top of Canada student loans, there are provincial student loans that obviously vary from province to province in terms of interest rates. For example, the average debt load in Nova Scotia in terms of federal and provincial government loans combined is $35,000. $35,000. Interest rates on provincial student debt vary, again, from province to province. Newfoundland and Labrador, I'm proud to say, has an interest rate of 0%. So does PEI. Other provinces, such as Alberta, have an interest rate on provincial government student loans of prime plus 5%. Ontario has prime plus 2.5%. These interest rates are staggering for a young person starting out in life. Again, they're provincial. My main focus is federal responsibility. That's my critic area. But in order to get to that, we need to understand the overall debt picture. Bottom line is this: too many Canadian students suffer from that crippling debt. Let me quote Laurie Campbell, Executive Director of Credit Canada. Student debt loads have never been higher. People are graduating with $30,000 in student loans on top of $5,000 in credit card debt. The result is that many students fall into a hole that they can't easily climb out of. For some, there's no climbing out of that hole. An estimated 140,000 Canadians are unable to make any payments on their Canada student loan. 147,000. I met recently with a young graduate who's been studying at Guelph University, and her loan payment was well over $450 a month. That's a car payment. That's half a mortgage payment, which she'll be paying back for years. Students tell me they can't buy houses, they can't buy cars, decent cars, they can't buy new cars, they can't start families because of that crippling student debt. It's obvious that that has an impact on the Canadian economy. More than that, this is the first Canadian generation that faces lower living standards than their parents, and this Conservative government is only making it worse. When asked earlier this year to predict what sort of living standards will be enjoyed in the future, 37% of the 1,000 respondents to a NANAS poll said the next generation will be worse off than Canadians today. To repeat, the next generation will be worse off than the one today. With higher debt loads, higher costs, lower wages, lower quality of public services, and lower job security, youth and students in this country aren't getting a fair shake. To quote Roxane Dubois, the former national chairperson of the Canadian Federation of Students, by undermining pensions, increasing student debt, and eliminating student jobs, the Harper government is balancing the budget by further straddling young people with more financial burdens. I mentioned credit card debt or private debt a moment ago. Now calculated in the figures in Canada provincial government student loans is the private debt, credit cards, lines of credit, general bank loans. We don't have any stats on combined public and private sector debt. Anecdotally, we hear some real horror stories. Student debt and tuition fees aside, the other concern that we've heard about across Canada has to do with public-private partnerships. More specifically, the issues of academic freedom, academic integrity. You know, the one thing I miss most of all from being a journalist is freedom. And I know what freedom means. I cherish it. And the question becomes, how free are the researchers? How free are the researchers? Those questions have been raised. Questions have also been raised about our college and trade system. Colleges and trades need to be closely linked to the needs of the job market, but how do we ensure that that's done in the right way, in the appropriate way? I also sit on the House of Commons Standing Committee on Human Resources and Skills Development, and we've been told for weeks that the link between trades colleges and employers is not close enough. There's a looming trade shortage. I hear that week after week in committee. How do we address it? How do we address it? These are real concerns that we've heard. The concern is that commercial interests are driving university research. For example, the danger there. What happens with the folklore department in Memorial University, for example, that studies the old Newfoundland and Labrador dialect if all research money is directed towards commercial output? The broader concern is what's being left behind in terms of the arts, in terms of humanities, in terms of social sciences, in terms of basic research in general. I met with a medieval studies professor recently, a member of the Canadian Association of University Teachers, who's worked for years in his field, and he's considered an expert. But because there's no real commercial interest in his expertise, he's had to literally patch together whatever funding scraps, whatever scraps of funding he can get his hands on to carry out his research. So on the one hand, there's money for commercially valuable research, market-driven research in our public, keyword here being public institutions. On the other hand, pure sciences, basic research, seems to be suffering. That's the message that we're getting. That's clearly an issue. There's also the issue of conservative contempt for research and science in general. I've spoken about that myself on the floor of the House of Commons. I've drilled the Conservatives with questions during QP. I see it in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, for example, in Newfoundland and Labrador. Scientists being muzzled. Scientists not being allowed to speak to journalists. Scientists not being allowed to speak their mind. I come from a place where the fishery collapsed in 1992. 20 years later, there's no recovery plan. If as a journalist you want to go in and speak to a scientist, you can't. Unless you submit your questions in advance, even then you sit down with a scientist and there's a public relations official next to you, monitoring every single thing that's said. I see this, I saw this myself as a journalist, and I see and I hear the stories now as a member of Parliament. We're seeing the gutting of basic research, as well as cuts to scientific laboratories, we've all heard about those, as well as cuts to monitoring that help us enforce important regulations like the Fisheries Act. We've seen cuts to programs at Environment Canada, Library and Archives Canada, and at the National Research Council of Canada. The Conservatives are also shutting down the National Council of Welfare and the First Nations Statistical Institute. Let's not forget the contempt for Stats Canada. Bottom line, we're seeing scientists muzzled and funding cuts to researchers and agencies who present opinions and findings that just happen to be contrary to those of the government's agenda. That's scary. That's dangerous. That's Canada changing in a way that, speaking for Newfoundlanders and Labradorians and Canadians, I don't think they want to see. That's scary. The Conservatives are even attacking charities so that they can no longer advocate. Let's bring this back to the federal government's role in education. There's no federal minister of education. There's nobody I can grill on the floor of the House of Commons with education questions. So far, as critic for the New Democrats, I have asked on the floor of the House of Commons a total of one question about post-secondary education in Canada. One question. That's not good enough. That's not good enough. I'd dearly love to ask questions. The Government of Canada distributes money to the provinces for education, funding through Canada's social transfers. It's up to the provinces to decide where that money is spent. The New Democrats have introduced a private member's bill that would create a post-secondary education act. The act would target post-secondary education funding outside of the Canadian social transfer that would be tied, key here, that would be tied to specific criteria and conditions related to affordability, and quality. There's that word, affordability, that I used at the beginning of my address. In our platform, the NDP has also promised $800 million to improve accessibility of post-secondary education, as well as $200 million in grants from the federal government. There's that other word, accessibility. There are major problems there. Speaking of accessibility, the federal government has a responsibility for Aboriginal education in this country. There are major problems, there are major concerns, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about them today. This is the time, this is the place to discuss outside-the-box ideas on how to redefine the federal government's role in post-secondary education. How do we ensure that post-secondary education is accessible? How do we ensure that post-secondary education is affordable? How do we reduce the average student debt load? How do we maintain the integrity of public institutions? How do we ensure that no student, that no Canadian, when it comes to education, is left behind? That's why we're here today. That's what this forum is about. I repeat, how do we ensure that no student, that no Canadian who wants an education is left behind? That's a question we all have to ask ourselves around this table. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming. Throughout the day, you'll see from your agendas, we'll have presentations by all the groups present. There's also, as I mentioned earlier, outside the door, a speaker's corner, where we encourage you to stand before the camera. Don't be shy. Make a statement. Make a statement on education. Say what you feel. That's what I'm about. Say what you feel. Be candid. Offer a solution. If you want to unload, that's your chance. Unload. And we'll post these clips once all is said and done. And again, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, social media is where it's at.